This is DW News Africa. Coming up on the program, how are aid cuts hurting vulnerable communities? In northern Nigeria, the number of children under 5 that are severely malnourished is on the rise. And now the US says it'll send help. Making matters worse, the region is experiencing a resurgence of Islamist attacks. We meet a former militant who says he's thinking about rejoining a terrorist group. Plus, the debt crisis in Africa. Many governments are now spending more on interest payments to creditors than on health and education. It's been called a devastating diversion of resources. Hello, I'm Christine Mundo. It's good to have your company. The US has approved $32 million in assistance to help Nigeria address hunger. This is a rare shift in foreign policy since President Donald Trump suspended most aid. The funding will support internally displaced people in areas affected by conflict. The UN says northern Nigeria is experiencing an unprecedented hunger crisis caused by insecurity and aid cuts. DW's West Africa correspondent Azizat Olaoluwa reports from a camp hosting displaced people in Gamboru, Ngala.
We are traveling to Gamboru, Ngala, an area in northeast Nigeria where Islamist jihadist group Boko Haram is still very active.
Fertile fields are being left untended as residents were forced to flee following years of attacks by criminal gangs. Many of them now live in displacement camps and depended on food aid, which has now stopped due to US funding cuts. Air travel is the only safest way of reaching the camps, as armed criminals have made the roads too dangerous.
This camp is the largest in Gamboru, Ngala. The refugees here are struggling to provide for their families. Travel beyond the camp borders is not safe, as armed militants surround the perimeter. Kore Garba just rushed her youngest son, 3-year-old Jime, to the stabilization center. There, he was diagnosed with severe malnutrition and other health complications.
My son had a fever and refused to eat, so I got him drugs. But then he got worse and I had to rush him to the clinic. My husband and I don't work and the food aid we live on is not enough.
The United Nations says this year, at least 1 million children face severe acute malnutrition here in Borno and 2 neighboring states. Stabilization centers like this have been set up to treat severe malnutrition, but it is the only one serving the entire area. A second center was closed due to lack of funding, putting pressure on the remaining workers. Besides the funding cuts, the UN says the lean season, a period when food is most scarce, has also contributed to the hunger crisis. Residents in this camp gather daily at this storage center, hoping to get more food, but there is just not enough to go around. This is all Kaltuma receives to feed her 8 children. She says it is just enough for 2 days, and she's not sure of how much, if any, food she will get in September.
I totally depend on the food we get here in the camp. I don't have any income. Once I exhaust my food and the food support stops, I'll be forced to take my children and start to beg.
The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, says they received just 1/3 of their expected funding for this year.
What we're extremely concerned about is the fate then of children under 5 who are severely, acutely malnourished. That's a life-threatening condition. And if they don't get medical assistance, we're at risk of 420,000 children dying in Nigeria.
But the new pledge by the US for food and nutritional assistance to Nigeria could be the lifeline for vulnerable people in conflict-affected areas like Borno.
The announcement by the US couldn't come at a more critical time. It may take some time, though, before the aid reaches people on the ground. So in the meantime, how is the Nigerian government handling the situation? It's a question I put to our correspondent who filed that report, Azizat Olaoluwa.
The national government has declared a national emergency on malnutrition, and the vice president 3 months ago inaugurated a board for a nutrition initiative to address widespread malnutrition in the country. And the UN official I also interviewed in that story assured me, or said he's hopeful anyway, that the Nigerian authorities would work with them to bridge the gap of the funding.
Now, the people we saw in your report, they've been displaced because of the insecurity in the region, caused, of course, by the Islamist insurgency, among other things. Just how devastating has this been for these communities?
Well, I can tell you, Christine, that it's quite devastating for them. For the two women I interviewed in my story, they've been in the settlement camp for over a decade, unable to work and unable to provide for their family as well, because they are walled in and they can't go outside the perimeter of the camp to work because of the threats of armed criminal gangs. These people cannot go back home as well because their communities are still not safe. So they are pretty much stranded in the camp. And now that funding aid has stopped, they told me that they feel helpless.
All right, that is Azizat Olaola reporting for us there. Thanks for the great reporting, Azizat. So as Azizat was just explaining, the insecurity fueled by an Islamist insurgency in northern Nigeria is one of the main reasons millions in the region have been displaced, and the violence is not letting up. This year, armed Islamist groups have reportedly ramped up their attacks. Nigeria's National Human Rights Commission says insurgents and bandits have killed more people in the first half of 2025 than in all of 2024. DW's Fani Fachar sent this report from Borno State, where the armed Islamist group Boko Haram and an Islamic State splinter group are active.
We are in Borno State, in the heartland of an insurgency primarily driven by the militant Islamist group Boko Haram and its rival faction, the Islamic State's West Africa province, or ISWAP. Ali, not his real name, says he was a commander in ISWAP for almost a decade. 2 years ago, he left the Islamist group in an amnesty deal offered by the Nigerian government to reintegrate militants into society. But now he says he's ready to take up arms again.
The government promised us jobs. That was the agreement. I don't have anything. No food, no job. When we go back, we are going to attack. Fight a war so we can eat and feed our families.
Ali is from Maiduguri, Borno's capital city in Nigeria's northeast. After a few years of relative calm in the region, there's been a renewed spate of attacks.
Our husbands were killed because of attacks. Children are growing up without their parents. We are scared of a resurgence of attacks.
At least 12 people were killed and many injured in June outside of Maiduguri. A suspected female suicide bomber detonated her explosives at a market. All indications point to either Boko Haram or ISWAP as being behind the attack.
While no group claimed responsibility for this bombing, there's been a wave of recent Islamist attacks in Nigeria's northeast, especially here in Borno State, including attacks on military outposts and civilians.
Modu Omate survived a roadside bomb a few months ago on the way to his farmland. He lost one of his legs in the explosion.
I'm scared. 8 people were killed that day. The military is not doing enough. Everyone was relaxed because it had been peaceful, but that was negligence. The military wasn't pursuing the militants. That's why they're strong again.
Nigeria's military has been stretched thin, confronted with multiple flashpoints across the country, and reintegration projects like the one here are important. But Borno State Commissioner admits that the program is not perfect.
Reintegration is working. It's work in progress. It's not everything that former insurgents wants that will be given to them. We have the victims to deal with. If we over-resource the insurgents, the victims will say, okay, what about us?
But experts warn, tackling terrorism won't work without addressing poverty and unemployment.
If we are not taken care of, if the government doesn't deliver, the attacks will escalate. It will not end.
Ali claims he doesn't believe in ISWAP's ideology anymore, but he's still planning to rejoin the terrorist group. Many, he says, who surrendered with him are ready to follow suit.
And to get some more context and insight into this, we've invited Dr. Fatima Akilu onto the program. She led Nigeria's first national Countering Violent Extremism program. She's now the executive director of the NEEM Foundation. That's an organization that runs field programs on rehabilitation, reintegration, mental health, and community resilience in the northeast of Nigeria. She's in Abuja today. Welcome to DW News Africa, Dr. Akilu. So in that report that we've just seen, Ali, a former terrorist, says he is ready to rejoin a militant group because he's not been able to find other job opportunities. Are there many more others like him?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And I think the story of Ali really reinforces the complexity of rehabilitation and reintegration, given the context of what's going on. So yes, we have come across, and there are some that have that say that they want to rejoin the group, and there are others who have rejoined the group. But I don't think or get the sense that it's widespread. Having said that, there's a lot of things that have happened in the 10, 12 years since the insurgency has been at its height. One of the reasons that we also see this kind of resurgence and disillusionment with rehabilitation and reintegration is because Nigeria has embarked on one of the largest scale reintegration programs. They're trying to reintegrate about 100,000 or more insurgents, their families, and their victims. This is a big ask for a country that is grappling with serious socio-economic challenges, living in a context where a lot of people are suffering from increased poverty, food insecurity now, lack of access to education. A lot of young people are struggling to get jobs. So this is the wider context in which this reintegration and insertion is happening.
So then, Dr. Akilu, if I could actually just come in on that point that you're making, these reintegration programs that were introduced by the government were meant to essentially rehabilitate extremists, introduce them back into society. With all that you're saying is the context, have these programs been a success or a failure then?
I wouldn't say that it was a failure. I would say that there are a lot of gaps, especially on the reinsertion end, where you have former militants, people who've taken up arms against communities, now trying to be reinserted back into those same communities or communities that have suffered from their actions, which has been very, very difficult for victims because they see these militants who have been through a government program, who come with some training and some resources, perhaps to set up businesses where there hasn't been that emphasis on victims. So what I see is that there are gaps in the rehabilitation and reintegration chain. It's not victim-centered. It's overwhelmingly geared towards dealing with insurgents. But even that, I think as a country, we have yet to work out a proper legal framework that will guide and underpin this program. So what happens is that some people who have committed huge atrocities, they don't go through any legal process and they are just reintegrated into communities. So it's very difficult for communities to really accept them.
Right. And on that point, Dr. Akilu, sorry to cut you off, but you're actually leading me to my next question, which is that former President Buhari, the late President Buhari, faced a lot of criticism when he took the decision to grant amnesty to the militants. To the point you're making, they didn't face any sort of legal repercussions. With hindsight now, should these people have been made to face more serious consequences for their terrorist activities?
Well, there hasn't been any real concerted amnesty that has been given as far as ideologically driven terrorists are concerned in Nigeria. So even within the period of time that President Buhari was president, there was no real amnesty on offer. Amnesty is very contentious in Nigeria. It's widely debated, and rightly so, because there's also a lack of complete understanding of what the elements of an amnesty program should be, especially where people are not brought to justice who have caused so much havoc and so much harm to communities at large. I think that there are ways that we can, as a country, engage people who have taken up arms against the state, whereby people who have committed the most egregious actions are brought to justice and face the full weight of the law. What happens is that there is a compounding of and a blurring of the lines of who is the perpetrator, who is the victim, and people all get swept into this one big pot. I think for low-level offenders, for victims who have been caught up in the insurgency and probably forced to fight against their will, there should be some kind of forgiveness. So whether you call it amnesty or healing, so that the nation can heal.
Well, Dr. Fatima Kilu, we appreciate your insights here on DW News Africa. Thanks very much.
Oh, thanks for the invitation.
African countries are experiencing severe debt troubles, with several governments having to sacrifice social spending to pay back creditors. Take Ghana, for example. At the start of the 2010s, the government was spending more of its budget on health and education, seen here in the light and dark blue lines. But after the government borrowed money on the markets, the interest payment burden began to grow. That's the red line, gradually rising, falling, and then spiking. Now, the largest share of Africa's debt, that's almost half of it, is owed to Western private creditors who tend to charge African countries higher interest rates. On the chart that you see, with the light blue bars, that Africa and the European Union have the same level of debt as a share of GDP. The stark difference is with the dark blue columns, where you see African countries, on average, spend 17% of their annual budgets paying interest on debt, compared to just 3% for the EU. This has led to growing calls for reform of the international financial architecture. And recently in Ghana, Pan-African activists protested in the capital, Accra, to put pressure on international financial institutions. Thousands of demonstrators marched through the streets, calling for the cancellation of Africa's debt and for systemic failures in international lending to be addressed. They say a solution is needed to provide immediate debt relief to economies under huge debt and to bring about structural reforms that prevent future crises.
When we get money, it goes to people whom we are owing. So we are not able to build schools. We are not able to service our children. We are not able to increase salaries of workers. So workers today, we are not fighting for anything around salary. We are only calling for global debt cancellation for African governments and African countries. We are tired.
Somalia has had a very, dangerous debt trap for decades. What we are demanding is we no longer need a new borrowing, a new debt. We do not want to go back to that same hole.
The cancellation of the debt will put us on a starting point, because right now Africa is at crossroads. So it will enable us to go back to the drawing board and to replan, re-strategize and reconfigure. What debt do we want? How do we want it? How do we monitor it, and what will be its results?
We don't want any debts tied to us, and our future generations need to be debt-free. So cancel those debts. Thank you.
So Pan-African activists calling for Africa's debt to be cancelled. But is it that simple? To talk more about Africa's debt dilemma, we've invited Nzioka Waita onto the program. He is Managing Director for Africa at the Tony Blair Institute, which published a paper this year titled A New Debt Deal for Africa, Breaking the Vicious Cycle. Welcome to DW News Africa, Mr. Waita. Why don't we begin with how we got here? Why are so many African countries either in or very close to being in debt distress?
Well, let's just say sort of 5 reasons. One is during the 2010s, lots of governments, very ambitious, elections all around the continent, bringing in a new set of leaders, a youthful population, highly connected, demanding to see progress and development, and as a consequence, governments borrowing to bridge the infrastructure gap. Cash was in large supply from across the world, multilateral, bilateral, and commercial money was easily available to finance primarily infrastructure programs across the continent. Now, high cost of borrowing, that money cost a lot of money. Then two, some of these governments, public finance architecture was very weak. So the ability to account for money that is borrowed and ensure that it's utilized for the appropriate purposes. Three was you can't live on bread alone. So even as you borrow money, countries need to be able to generate their own income. Tax mobilization or domestic revenue mobilization, very weak in a number of countries across the continent. Then three, external shocks. War in Ukraine, war in the Middle East, crash of oil across the world, increase of oil across the world, adversities of climate change, and then the mother of all, COVID pandemic, which really put Africa into a tailspin. So a lot of these things combined to make a very unfortunate situation. And then, of course, just poor debt management in terms of relationships with multilaterals across the world.
Right. Why don't we take a listen to recent remarks made by Ghana's finance minister, and we'll pick up from there.
The African countries borrow so expensive as compared to its peers in other parts of the world. Why should it be? Why should the risk premium for African countries be so different from Europe, America, and other parts of the world? Why should that be?
So here you have Ghana's finance minister asking the question about why Africa pays such high interest rates. Private sector lenders, as we know, charge African countries higher interest rates. Is that justified?
Well, for starters, it's true. It's a fact, you know. On average, African countries borrow at north of 10% from multilateral institutions, public debt, from commercial debt. It can even be up to 30%. By comparison, within the EU and G7 countries, some of them are borrowing at 3%. So you can see the huge disparities. Now, some of this is driven by what we call negative risk perception. Now, in some instances, it's pure perception. In other cases, it is the reality. But the perception seems to have carried the day, much to the detriment of the global south.
And now there's been a lot of talk about debt restructuring for Africa. What is the goal of this debt restructuring, and what progress has been made in this regard?
Well, the international finance system, as we know it, is fundamentally broken. If you look at the countries that are in debt distress or near debt distress, so far it is only Ghana and Zambia that have managed to go through extremely painful debt restructuring conversations within what we call the G20 common framework, which basically means, number one, sit with multilateral institutions like IMF, World Bank, and others. Then two, sit down with bilateral lenders. So if you borrowed from France or from China or from the European Union or some other bilateral, Japan as a case in point, you sit and negotiate with them. Now, the more complex bit is commercial lenders, private sector lenders, people who have a profit imperative. They're not in the business of development for development's sake. They lend you money because they expect to make a return on it. Now, trying to get all these people to agree to take a haircut, as in take a reduction or cancellation of the money that you owe them, is not the easiest thing. And geopolitics comes into play in a very big way. So, for example, if you're sitting with a group of lenders that are largely Western, they will agree to, they might want to agree to restructure the debt, maybe take less or increase the time that you have to pay back the amounts that borrowed. But they won't do so unless lenders like China equally agree to the same terms, because they will not give you headroom by reducing what you owe them so that you can pay off debts owed to countries that they consider to be not aligned to their way of thinking. And this is more of like an East-West situation, and African countries get caught in the middle.
Right, Nzioka Waita from the Tony Blair Institute. Thanks very much. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
And that's it for the program. Bye-bye.